Hello, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you back to the conversation with Professor Wang Gungwu. As you know, last week we covered the period of the century of humiliation and its impact on US-China relations. Today we are going to move beyond the century of humiliation and cover the period from the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949 till today. And I'm going to begin by asking Professor Wang Gungwu about in a sense, the truly major war that the US and Chinese forces fought against each other, which was the Korean War from June 25th, 1950 to July 27, 1953. So the first question I'm going to ask you, Gungwu, is could this war have been avoided? And what damage did this war do to US-China relations?
It probably could have been avoided if the Americans had made it very clear that they were not going to let anybody take South Korea. And that, in other words, they were prepared to fight for South Korea. But apparently, some of the leaders in the State Department had been a bit vague about that their defense line was really more about Japan. That was the ultimate line. And they didn't say anything about South Korea. And that misled Kim Il-sung and the Russians to believe that there was an opportunity to take South Korea, that the Americans were not prepared to stick out their necks out to fight for South Korea.
So the Russians are pushing Kim Il-sung more than the Chinese.
Oh, no, Chinese were not pushing anybody.
Yes.
And the Russians, I wouldn't say was pushing, but when Kim Il-sung wanted to do it, the Russians were looking at the opportunities and didn't actually stop him. Stalin didn't say, you can't.
Yeah.
So,
and at that time, Stalin was much more powerful than
Mao.
Mao.
More powerful, and Stalin did not want to come into open because he didn't want to come in direct conflict with the United States, because the United States was watching the Russians. So when Mao Zedong was approached, the information that I have seen is that the Russians encouraged the Chinese to go in because they can't go in. And the Mao Zedong weighed it very carefully, I believe. And they did so because they were afraid that if Kim Il-sung did that without any support from them, then the unification of Korea under Kim Il-sung, backed by the Russians, may also affect them. Where they just started, they'd only just won the war in China. They were in need of all kinds of things from Russia. They needed Russian help. But what they did not need is to have trouble on their borders. So I think they had tremendous difficulty agreeing to this. I believe they debated a long time.
They were not enthusiastic about it.
They were not enthusiastic, and they couldn't stop Kim Il-sung anyway.
They couldn't.
They couldn't have. Kim Il-sung wouldn't have listened to them. Kim Il-sung would have listened to Stalin.
Oh.
But Stalin did not stop him. So when he started the war, the Chinese had to decide whether to support or not support. And not to have supported him would have also been a different message and would have put Kim Il-sung very hostile towards China thereafter. So there are all kinds of considerations. And after fierce debate, they decided to go in. But they knew it was a terrible cost because they were not prepared for that kind of war against the most modern armed forces in the world, led by the United Nations or United States for the United Nations. But they decided that they had to do it. So by that time Kim Il-sung decided to go to the war, it was probably unavoidable that Mao Zedong would get in. But even then, as I said, there was fierce debate, but Mao Zedong did decide to go in. And the United States didn't really expect it. I think they were a bit shocked, and MacArthur was furious. And one of the reasons why he was prepared to push into Manchuria to take over, and in fact even prepared to use the nuclear weapons. And he was sacked for that because Truman refused to do it.
That was very brave of Truman, right?
It was really quite a remarkable decision.
Yeah.
And MacArthur was a very popular general when he was sacked. And he went back to America. He was welcomed as a great hero.
Yes.
So Truman took a brave decision, definitely.
So anyway, both Truman and Mao, in some ways, took very brave decisions to fight in that war. And the interesting thing is how what a strong personality Mao Zedong was. And as we know, China is fortunate to have at least two great leaders in the 20th century, Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. And what's interesting is that when Western scholars discuss these two leaders, they often are much more critical of Mao Zedong and criticize him for several disasters, including the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. At the same time, they also give Deng Xiaoping credit for reducing poverty dramatically in China and making China a great economic power. So if you had a vote among Western scholars or Western observers on China, they would say Deng is a greater leader than Mao. But within China, Mao is regarded as a much greater leader than Deng Xiaoping. How do you explain this? Why do the Chinese people revere Mao Zedong so much?
I think there's a big difference. Mao was the great leader. Deng Xiaoping was one of his loyal supporters. Right up to the Cultural Revolution,
Yes.
he was still a supporter of Mao Zedong. And not even the immediate number two or number three, he was a bit further down, but still one of the very loyal supporters. All the achievements, unification of China, winning the Civil War against the Kuomintang, in a way, major contributions towards keeping China safe from Japan at the northern part, where his Eighth Route Army held control. All these things that he was able to lead the Communist Party to victory through all those difficulties, and then to go through the whole cycle of change, transforming a very battle-worn country, very economically poor, to the point when they were beginning to make their presence felt in the world. All that was done by Mao under his leadership.
So he picked up a broken country,
and
put it together
he
again.
gave them a sense of identity and pride, and a new China with great hope. The aspirations of Young were tremendous. Of course, his greatness was also the cause of his great failures. You might say the very fact that he failed was because he was so great, that he failed. He made some mistakes, and that every mistake he's made had great consequences.
Yeah, because he was so powerful.
It's because he's so powerful.
Yeah.
So, but in the end, the benefits that he brought to China by success and victory was definitely a great moment in history.
So when he said China had stood up,
Yeah.
that was a good
and nothing compared to that. Deng could not have done what he had done if not because Mao
That's
had
right.
laid the foundations.
Foundations,
I think
yeah.
that's how the Chinese will see it. They say Mao Zedong made some mistakes at the end of his life.
Yeah.
It's a pity. He would have been even greater if he hadn't lived that long, so to speak. But in the end, what he achieved was absolutely stupendous, compared to which Deng Xiaoping was doing some repair job, cleaning up after the mess, and did a very good job, fine job. But Deng Xiaoping was not always right either.
Yeah.
Deng Xiaoping also made many mistakes. He went too far one way, too relaxed, and therefore he had the Tiananmen
Yes.
massacre was partly because Deng Xiaoping had been a bit too lax. He was also a bit lax about decentralizing, so that later on they had a tremendous job pulling back, tightening, and the party got corrupted by too quick a move towards capitalism, when he said that some people must get rich first before others, and so on.
Yeah.
All these things misled a lot of people, and some of the corruption that followed, even before Tiananmen, all the way down to Xi Jinping, and became worse and worse and so on. Some people would blame that on Deng Xiaoping, that he had not foreseen that, and he had allowed, by being too relaxed too early, had allowed some of that to happen under his successors, so that Xi Jinping had to come in, clean up some more. So it's hard to. It depends on what emphasis you give. If you want to emphasize the horrendous things the mistakes that Mao Zedong made, you can say Mao Zedong was an absolute failure and turn him into a kind of monster. And so. But that's not how the Chinese people see it. You must look at what he did first. So the mistakes are regrettable, but probably forgivable, given the remarkable achievements that he first achieved.
I guess if you didn't have someone with the kind of iron will of Mao Zedong, the country would have been difficult to pull the country together and make it one strong country again.
Yes, iron will, but more than that, it was cunning.
Wow.
Cunning. He was very smart. He made use of his young colleagues one against the other, played them against the others. He was a highly skilled strategist, both political and military strategist. He strategized and he seized power in all sorts of ways. I mean, he was not an easy or innocent person in that. He was tremendously ruthless to achieve what he did at the expense of a lot of other people. But whatever he did, in the end, for various reasons, he made all the right decisions for the great successes of the first 20 years of that, from the end of the war with Japan all the way to the Cultural Revolution, you can say, up to the Great Leap Forward. I would say that Mao Zedong's successes will far outnumber his failures. So that, I think people still say that he deserves to be treated as the founder of it all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other person who recognizes that Mao Zedong was a great man was another great American, Henry Kissinger. And as you know, Henry Kissinger made a surprise, dramatic visit to Beijing in July 1971. You were 40 years old then. I'm sure this visit must have made an impression on you. And I'm just asking, just from memory, what do you remember about this visit? And what were your thoughts and impressions as you said, wow, this is unusual? And how do you think future historians will assess the significance of this visit by Kissinger?
There's no question about that being both a remarkable decision that he could persuade Nixon to let him go. But for myself, I was in a slightly different position and saw it slightly differently because I happened to be in Australia at the time. And in other words, there was a move, pressure against the United States position of hostility against China was already being pushed back by majority of the members of the General Assembly. Secondly, I had also been reading up about the Sino-Soviet split.
And the fighting in Ussuri.
From late 1950s already onwards, when Khrushchev came in, and Mao Zedong was extremely unhappy with Khrushchev, the way he treated Stalin at the one hand, but also his more conciliatory voice with the West. He was very suspicious of Khrushchev. And he also felt that he deserved a higher reputation than Khrushchev. Who was Khrushchev?
Schoolboy.
Nothing. Whereas he was as good as Stalin. If not better, he wouldn't dare to claim that. But he was a great revolutionary who led a country to independence. What did Khrushchev do? So he had contempt for Khrushchev. So the Sino-Soviet split had already begun in the late 1950s. So by the time of the 1960s, it was increasingly clear that China and Russia was suspicious of one another, no longer trust each other, and the growing hostility was making it almost impossible for them to collaborate about anything except Vietnam. They were helping Vietnam in the Vietnam War. But apart from the Vietnam War, the split was becoming very obvious by the late 1960s. So that when the United Nations admitted China and the United States couldn't stop it, Australia, who had been supporting America all along, began to change their minds. So Whitlam had actually gone to China as opposition leader of the Australian government, Labour Party leader, had gone to China before Kissinger arrived in. Before that. So I happened to know these people in Australia at the time and knew about Whitlam's trip to China, which was hammered by the government. The government said you can't do that. The opposition is pro-communist and so on. So Whitlam went, and just a few weeks later, Kissinger went.
I see.
So although Kissinger's thing is remarkable, where I stood in Australia, Whitlam had already made the move. But Kissinger's calculations are different. Is to calculate on the Sino-Soviet split, that this is a time to get the Chinese away from the Soviet orbit and encourage the Chinese to be even more anti-Soviet. So it was in that context that I didn't quite immediately see that as the turning point.
Yes.
But looking back, there's no question the fact that Kissinger would go at the behest of Nixon, the president of the United States, and arranging for the president to visit China is an amazing transformation in the whole political scene.
Yeah, but it must have, it showed that both Nixon and Kissinger, and I think this is confirmed also by Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, were very astute students of geopolitics, you know, and probably in a class by themselves. I remember Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was once asked, who would you consider to be the greatest American president? And he actually said Richard Nixon.
The Chinese actually agree with that.
The Chinese also agree with that. What were the
he
Chinese
was a great
impression?
friend to that. To Chinese, that was a great friend.
Friendly
act.
What do you remember about any of the discussions that took place between Kissinger and Nixon and the Chinese leaders? What do you remember, if anything, about that period?
Well, I'm a bit confused about all that because I went to, at that point, followed in great detail all the problems with Nixon afterwards and all the reports about what was on his tape and so on with Kissinger.
Watergate.
So, Watergate.
Yeah.
So that a lot of my memories about that got caught up with all the details. Some rather nefarious ideas were exchanged at that time. So I must confess that I didn't have a very positive view of this kind of machinations in the White House at that time. And Watergate was a fascinating story for most of us who read it at the time. So that, in a way, colored my attitudes towards Nixon. But admiration for Kissinger never stopped. That was remarkable. But of course, his background is so different. And in his case, I would say he benefited from the fact that he was moving among the highest analysts in the American universities who understood Russia and who saw the Sino-Soviet split as being particularly significant and really believed it, because there are some others who believe they're communists anyway, all a bunch of communists, don't trust them. But he and this realistic group of analysts say, this is a great opportunity to break this up, because that combination is a threat to us. But divided, and if China could be at least partly on our side and at least away from the Soviets, will give us a tremendous leverage over the Russians. I think that part was part of his academic background too, that scholars had done the work to show that this is a serious split. It isn't just quarreling among comrades. They really were bitterly opposed to each other. And that, I think, that reading is very important. And I think Kissinger was emboldened by that to actually say to Nixon, and as I understand, to say to Nixon, this split is serious. We can take advantage of this.
Yeah, I'm sure that split was also the key reason why Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, of course, we must mention Zhou Enlai, were very welcoming of both Kissinger and Nixon. But at the same time, what's interesting is that the Chinese have always had a kind of mixed feelings about the West, regarding it with great admiration, and at the same time also recognizing that the West played a role in humiliating China and so on and so forth. So how, as you take a sort of a longer view here of China's attitudes towards Western civilization as a whole, and I don't know whether this is a fair question. I'm sure one man who actually understood Western history very well was Zhou Enlai. How would you characterize the attitudes of a man like Zhou Enlai, towards the West? How would he regard it, and how would he see his strengths and weaknesses?
My understanding of Zhou Enlai was he was fundamentally a Mandarin in his instincts, serving his country, serving whoever is a ruler, loyally and intelligently, would be his upbringing and his whole background, his family background, would put him in that sort of position, which makes him a top Mandarin in the best Confucian context, as it were. At the same time, he had been to the West. He belongs to that generation, together with the young May 4th generation, who knew that the West has something to offer China, by absolutely no question. And because the slogans like science and democracy, which was thrown around at that time, everybody, almost everybody in China agreed that these were the two things that China needed to be a modern country.
Science and democracy.
And democracy, both. And I think at that point, even the communists didn't really disagree with it. The Chinese Communist Party didn't disagree with that. They accepted that these were the two thrusts. They just defined democracy differently, but they accepted that the concepts were vital to China's modernization process. And I think they had no question. They rejected the traditions. They were agreed that the traditions had failed us. We were wonderful in the past for 2,000 years, but 2,000 years too long. And they were slow to react. Therefore, we are in this terrible position. Now we must catch up. And science and democracy will be the key. And I think that was right across the board, with the exception of some old generation people who were old conservatives. The vast majority of the Chinese people would go along with that. And I think they have been consistent about that. Their success in sciences are proven. We know that, no question at all. Their success with democracy is in dispute because they have defined democracy in a way which is unacceptable to the liberal Democrats who have interpreted that to mean the Anglo-American parliamentary system,
elections,
the Republican, French Republican system. These are the proper way to do democracy. Whereas the Chinese have we've reinterpreted Marx and Lenin and so on to mean that as long as you're caring for the people, you're doing it in the name of the people, for the sake of the people, and the people respond and agree and like what you do, that is democracy. And that is a little bit closer to a Chinese traditional idea of a caring emperor. The Son of Heaven is after all there because he's morally the person to provide the welfare, caring for the welfare of the people, and ultimately help making the people peaceful, happy, prosperous, harmonious, and so that's part of his responsibility as the Son of Heaven. So that's a little bit nearer to what the Chinese would normally expect their leaders to be anyway. So the question of democracy, however, has caused tremendous drifts within the Chinese public, arguing among themselves precisely what they need. There are Chinese who would prefer the Anglo-American system, believe that way, participatory democracy, enabling you to change your rulers by the people directly and peacefully without killing each other. That's a much better way. Whereas others feel, provided it doesn't create chaos and anarchy and disruptions and continual internal fights and so on, and provide what the people need. They are so poor, go to lift them, care for them. So they put a different priority on that. And that priority, I think, has led them more and more to say the kind of system that the traditional Chinese had, which is now modernized by the Chinese Communist Party, is probably what we need. And this is what China needs to succeed. And it's proven to be more or less right. Today, I would say most Chinese would say, yes, I think we got it right, because otherwise we'll have civil wars, we'll have tremendous difficulties getting people all agreed. There's so many different opinions. You need leaders, strong leaders, who provide a sense of direction, a vision to lead the way, and then ensure that this is done peacefully and harmoniously, and everybody, most people, are enjoying the benefits of that. And we don't take the risks of all this up and down. And they look at some of the democracies outside, has actually confirmed in many of the people in China that that's probably not what we need in China. But what has been done in China has actually worked so far. So why not stick with this? And this fits in with our tradition. It doesn't go against any of our traditional ways of doing things. And to have a new class, new set of mandarins doing that job, selected for their skills and devotion and utter loyalty to do the job, provided they're not corrupt, is probably the best the best thing we can do at the moment.
I'm just going to fast forward to 2020. And wouldn't you agree that COVID-19 in many ways, when the Chinese see how much better they have handled COVID-19, where 4,000 or 5,000 deaths, and the United States is now exceeding 300,000 deaths, Has that in some ways also helped to confirm the
There
Chinese?
is no doubt that the Chinese are interpreting that to confirm what they've been inclined to believe anyway, and that is their system works better when there's a crisis, and that people can unite and can share the burden of trying to solve a problem together, a sense of being brought together and united in their efforts to do something, whereas they feel even more than ever that the kind of freedom that has been so much talked about only leads to so much disagreement and inability to support a unified or a national, purposeful way of solving national crisis problems. You know? So I think the Chinese at the moment are actually almost gloating at what they think they have achieved compared to what all the so-called Western liberal democratic countries have failed to achieve.
This may be a good moment for us to pause our discussion on week 2, because when we come to week 3, we are actually going to touch upon some of the difficulties that have arisen in the US-China relationship. And one of them, of course, being the misunderstandings about their political system. So thank you very much, Gungwu, for joining us on these discussions for week 2 of this course. Thank you.